Hello and welcome to another Hoeg Law live postmortem, this time on one of the bigger movie events of 2021, which isn't necessarily saying that much given the year that we are in. But Zack Snyder's Justice League released on HBO Max, the streaming service, earlier this week, Thursday to be precise. And I think the world of the internet has a lot to say about it. Now, before I get started, if somebody could just mention that they can hear me and we can clear up that this is all working. I've had previous issues with live streams and microphones and everything else. I would very much appreciate it. And then we will get started talking about all things Justice League and what works and what doesn't work. And there's a lot of both, to be honest with you. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. Like all live streams that we do, and I am still waiting just to be clear on somebody saying that the microphone is working and that y'all can hear me, is an area of controversy, right? The Zack Snyder Justice League project is a very interesting kind of thing that arose out of the 2017 Justice League that was taken over by Joss Whedon and the intervening years where Zack Snyder, the director of Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman, and in some respects, the creative head of the DC Extended Universe, came out and said, well, look, I could make my version. I've got the cut. I've got the material that I need. And that started the Release the Snyder Cut movement on the internet, which some describe as toxic, some describe as problematic. Either way, regardless of the people behind those kinds of hashtags, I'm happy to say that this is a very interesting project and one that I think is entirely worthwhile to talk about. I've watched it about 1.5 times. Now, if you aren't familiar with Zack Snyder's Justice League, it is just a little bit more than 4 hours long, and we will definitely talk about that as part of our conversation. But it is an immensely interesting project for someone that follows film, that follows storytelling as I do, because you get the rare chance to look at what was a Studio Notes version that was cut apart, that was clearly built to be like the Avengers in 2017, and you get to compare it to what is very self-evidently Zack Snyder Unleashed in terms of a 4-hour runtime, in terms of indulgent music video montage sequences with slow music interposed over comic book imagery, and all the things that, if you don't like Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman or Zack Snyder films in general, are probably going to drive you up a wall. But that being said, I've gotten a couple of thumbs up. I've gotten a couple of people saying that the mic works. They can hear me. So let's dive into this thing. At the end of this, like we did in the WandaVision live stream, I will have conversations with you. I will be taking questions. So, if you want to save those questions for that, if you want to save any super chats, I'm not going to be looking at the chat as I talk about this so much because I want to get through my thoughts first, and then we will talk amongst ourselves about everybody's thoughts on the Justice League. So, Zack Snyder's Justice League, 4 hours long, a completely different interpretation of the very same events, give or take, that occurred in 2017. Now, 2017's version is, and obviously everything that I say here is subjective, it's my opinion, it's going to be spoiler-filled, so if you haven't seen it or you want to see it, leave now. But the 2017 version is terrible. I'm a person that actually is relatively interested in the Man of Steel, Batman versus Superman direction that Zack Snyder has gone. And I think it didn't work for a lot of people because I don't think it is the archetypal version of these characters in Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and everybody else now that we'll talk about in the Justice League that was presented in those movies. It's almost like you had normal versions of these characters that had their own movie series 10 years ago, and then Zack Snyder was doing a what-if scenario. What if Batman were broken? What if Superman and his family wasn't quite as noble and as good, and does he have these kind of broken feelings as well to get you to Batman versus Superman? But even in that instance, even thinking that, Zack Snyder's Justice League is essentially the step to try to rectify that. Batman is motivated throughout the movie to try to make amends, right what once went wrong, to use some Quantum Leap terminology from back in the day. And it really comes through in an entirely different way in this version than it did in 2017. So if you go and you look at 2017's version, the goal of Joss Whedon and Warner Brothers was to get you in and out of this movie as quickly as possible. And like I said at the start of this, we're going to talk about the 4-hour runtime. There is no question that this movie, the Zack Snyder cut, could be cut down, and I think it probably should be We'll talk about that. But what you got in 2017 was far too rapid. You had essentially this parademon, this winged monster thing that Batman is attacking and knows its existence and finds about the mother boxes by killing really at the start of this sequence. You also, at the start of the sequence in 2017, get a feel for how vastly different the skills of the directors are. Love him or hate him, Zack Snyder has a cinematic eye. He puts cinematic imagery on screen. Joss Whedon is effectively an up-jumped Buffy the Vampire Slayer director, and this is the same, if you can believe it, in the original Avengers movie. If you go back and you look at that, you see a lot of smallness in terms of scale, in terms of that direction. Doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, I love the original Avengers, and the quippy Marvel characters worked well with Joss Whedon's writing at the time. By changing the actual Justice League framework in 2017, though, Warner Brothers and Joss Whedon lost what was ever going to be epic or operatic or in-depth from what Zack Snyder was trying to do. And I think Warner Brothers, probably rightly at the time, thought it was a bad idea to do that, thought it was a better idea to emulate the Avengers. And the Zack Snyder leaving the actual project was an opportunity for Warner Brothers, obviously under tragic circumstances, if you heard those stories, family issues that I don't think are necessarily important to go into when we talk about the movies themselves, but he had to leave. Joss Whedon picked up the reins, and if you go and you watch these two movies back to back, as I did over the last couple of days, you can see how much Joss Whedon was either intending himself or tasked with making the Justice League into the Avengers. A lot more quips, a lot more color, which we will see, and by comparison, Zack Snyder's version is all muted colors and kind of sickly greens and works much better for, I think, the costumes that he was putting together, the sets he was putting together. It creates an almost mythic kind of feel. The other thing we have to talk about, of course, is, as you can see on your screen right now, this box image, right? These things that jump out to you when you watch the Zack Snyder cut of the Justice League. It is done in what amounts to an old-time TV ratio. Now, Zack Snyder has said in interviews this was designed to use the IMAX system to its best effect, but nobody's watching this in IMAX. We're all watching it at home. And I will say, when you start it up, it's a little bit jarring. You go from what is the usual kind of widescreen approach to this box. I will also say, however, that some of the things that he has said in interviews, which might sound dumb if you just read them, like there's a verticality here and it adds negative space on the top and bottom and creates this kind of scope, is in fact accurate. You get much more large-scale imagery and a large-scale imagery effect in a number of instances in the movie. Now, is it still kind of indulgent and unnecessary? Yes, I would say it probably is. But I have to say that there are instances where it really works. You can see Batman right here walking across this mountain, and this introduction is actually kind of a good introduction for what the differences are in the movie, right? In 2017, you have Batman fighting a parademon on what looks like the Batman Forever set. He dies, he shows some other boxes, and Batman says, I'm gonna go get him, and that kind of thing. Versus here, in the Zack Snyder cut, you have Superman screaming, waking up the mother boxes. You get an introduction to the various places you're going to go, like Atlantis and Themyscira, and I always pronounce it wrong, so I apologize for that. And it serves as a much better kind of backdrop to introducing the world that it's going to take place in, while also providing that Batman doesn't know that any of this is happening. In fact, Batman doesn't find out that any of this is happening until really the end of part 2. And that's another thing to point out. Zack Snyder has made this movie into what amounts to a binge-watch Netflix series. He's got parts. He's got nice hard stops cut to blacks between the end of a part and the start of the next part. And it creates an interesting sensation in watching. And I think he did a good enough job in making arcs within those parts, but it creates this kind of epic feel. You're watching an epic of comic book characters when, if anything, 2017 feels like the opposite of that. It's anything but epic. Part of that is that color palette, right? If you look at the 2017 version, and you can always tell when I'm looking at one or the other by the aspect ratio that we're looking at, you have these bright cartoon colors. This is a scene that doesn't appear in Zack Snyder's cut. In fact, the motivations for Lois Lane are completely different, but it jumps out at you exactly how colorful these kinds of shots are. And this happens time and time again, right? The sets aren't really built for this blowout and this color saturation, and they look much better in Zack Snyder vision, even if you don't necessarily like this, usually. So those are 2 or 3 of the top things that you notice when you just turn this thing on, right? It's got a different aspect ratio. It's got a different coloration. It's got a different introduction. It's got different motivations for Batman right at the start. The other major thing that you will see that is a vast, vast improvement, in my opinion, is the musical score, right? This scene actually with Batman just walking to the camp has a wonderful musical score. It might be one of my favorite pieces of music in the movie, and there is nothing like it in 2017 because this entire sequence is essentially just Batman walking up to the side of the cliff and looking down at the settlement below him, rather than this kind of walking, this Lord of the Rings style of I have to get somewhere and it's difficult to cross this mountain. So in 2017, what is just a throwaway line, oh, he crossed the mountain to get here, is actually shown to some effect in the Zack Whedon version, or Zack Whedon. Yep, there you go. Zack Whedon. Now that's a version of the Justice League. Zack Snyder's version, and you get this massive scope and feel. At the same time, you get this self-indulgence, right? When you're talking about these kinds of things, you see this self-indulgence. I was watching Zack Snyder's Justice League with my wife when it first came out, and in the first 15 minutes or so of the movie, after Batman fails to recruit Aquaman and he's in this northern village, you get, 2 or 3 minutes of what sounded like Icelandic singing to the ocean, representative of probably what Aquaman means to these people and a kind of status where he has a song in this way, but it doesn't change anything in the movie. It's just Zack Snyder doing stuff on film. And this is one of those areas where you can clearly understand if you're sitting in the Warner Brothers boardroom and saying, okay, Zack, we can cut the Icelandic singing, that they're right and he's wrong in terms of moving a movie along. But when you're watching this, you kind of get the whole package. You get some really good changes. You get some really good, interesting motivations, coloration, cinematic scope. You also get 3 minutes of Icelandic singing, which sounds like it could be a t-shirt, but it is the truth. The next aspect I want to talk about is really the motivations. I've seen on the internet a lot of people talking about the fact that this movie is effectively the same. And if you look at the plot points in 2017, the major ones, and you look at the plot points here in 2021, there's 3 mother boxes. Guy comes to get the mother boxes. He gets this one and this one and this one. They fight him in the sewers. They fight him in Russia. And the end. That's all accurate. It's the same kind of skeleton structure of a movie. What is completely different, however, are the motivations of all these people. Right? The motivations of Batman and Diana from the start are really directed. They're working as a team to get these people together. Batman doesn't know of everything that's happening with respect to quote unquote mother boxes. He has a fairly incredulous reading of mother boxes. What are those? Which is a perfectly reasonable thing to ask an hour and a half into the movie, because he has just been basing his delivery here of going and getting these people for his Justice League on Lex Luthor's threats at the end of Batman versus Superman, that bad things are coming. Batman feels guilty about killing Superman, even though he didn't do so directly, and he is trying to make amends. And that works much better, to my eye, than Batman just fighting a parademon that we don't know and having these pictures of boxes appear throughout the world that he then directs and essentially helps Diana explain the history of. Diana, at the end of part 2, gives the entire history of these mother boxes, explains how a presence named Darkseid, which really is only mentioned once in the 2017 version and doesn't make an appearance as a character, and it's a little hard to understand what he is, that she gives this entire history because her plot line up until that point in the movie is more useful. She gets the arrow from Themyscira after they lose the mother box. She is delivered to the history wall where she understands what happened and can deliver this understanding to Bruce, and they are working together as equals to solve this when it's very much not the case in 2017. And this continues really throughout the rest of these discussions, is that you've got different motivations leading to different conversations, leading to weaker kind of CW-esque plotting in the 2017 version, where you get a lot more introspection on character in the 2021 version, right? I've pulled up a screenshot now of the Flash, who gets an introduction scene. Now, this introduction scene, as you might imagine, is in slow motion and features a musical choice from Mr. Zack Snyder that is juxtaposed to that slow motion and to that action and can very easily feel indulgent. But it does provide a better kind of foundation for who Flash is, what he's doing, why he's going to be involved with this project. And it also cuts down, even though it is quirky, on some of the quirkiness that Joss Whedon introduced to the project. Very similarly, and much more importantly in this movie, Cyborg, who basically just appears and does things in the 2017 version, gets an entire introduction, what amounts to almost a half origin movie about who he is, how he got this way, what he can do. And the relationship between him and his father, Silas Stone, is so much more impactful. And again, I warned about spoilers. One of the things that happens in 2021 is that you have a schism between Victor Stone, Cyborg, and his father, Silas Stone. You have these voiceovers from the scientist's father talking about what he can do. You have a moment here in the middle of the movie where he crushes the tape recorder right when his father is about to connect with him heart to heart. And the rest of the movie, the rest of Cyborg's plot line, is him understanding the loss of his family, understanding exactly what they did for him, and getting over it. In fact, the last thing that the mother boxes try to do as part of the Unity is to convince him that he can go and have a family that he never got to have, that he never enjoyed in life if he just joins them. And it's the kind of standard, tropey villain tries to convince the good guy to come over to his side, but you understand so much more about it. And actually finding the mother boxes is not just Cyborg jacking into a computer like he does in 2017, but is in fact his father's final self-sacrificial act, which gets you to the end of the movie where he uses his powers over machinery, which I don't know if they exist in the comic books. It was unclear. They weren't properly introduced in this movie, but he uses his power over machinery to restore that tape recorder, and you get one of those final voiceovers of his father talking about life and love and light. And it works supremely well. It works far better than Lois Lane's kind of over-talk of the end of the 2017 version because it's more impactful. Lois Lane really isn't a character in the 2017 version. She's not really that much of a character in the 2021 version, which is fine as long as you don't give her the final voiceover. Instead, Silas Stone gets that voiceover. And, you know, ever since Miles Dyson in Terminator 2, I've loved that actor, and he does a fantastic job along with the music of sending you off to the end of the movie. And it's a great ending, except it's not the ending of the movie, and we'll talk about that in a second. So you have Bruce and Diana working together. You have a bit of improvement for Aquaman. You don't actually have a lot. He maybe gets the shortest shrift here. You get one additional scene with him and Willem Dafoe where they talk about him not wanting to take up the mantle of king, which is going to be picked up in the Aquaman movie, although there are a lot of interesting kind of discrepancies. You've got Mira in this movie talking in a British accent with clearly differently colored hair than the Aquaman movie will do. You've got this kind of conceit where they're in the water. They talk like, I don't know, porpoises, dolphins to each other. And so every time they want to talk in English, they have to make an air bubble, which is a number of times in this movie. Obviously not carried over in Aquaman. Things that are unimportant and small, but do create this kind of division in the DC extended universe that you don't get in the Marvel universe. Obviously, this version of the movie didn't exist when Aquaman was being concepted out, and Joss Whedon had already taken over. So you can allow for some of these things, but it does add certain interests here. Flash, we talked about. He gets that indulgent stuff. He also gets an important beat when they're bringing back Superman. In this version in 2021, he misses hitting the mother box when he needs to and essentially reverses time, and you can see that for just a moment. Now, we knew Flash could time travel and be involved in time travel kind of shenanigans from Batman versus Superman, where effectively Flash shows up after the nightmare that Batman has and says, am I too soon? Lois Lane is the key, and some other nonsense that doesn't really fit directly into that movie so well. But in this one, he can time travel. He can reverse that time, and it is used to great effect at the end when the heroes effectively lose. The Unity is formed, the Earth is going to be shattered, and the Flash gets that moment in the sun. Steppenwolf, the actual bad guy here, also gets a tremendous improvement in this movie. He isn't just a guy that talks about the boxes like they actually have his mother in them. He is not just a guy that's here to conquer the world. He's clearly the secondary, tertiary conqueror, much like the people, the Chitauri, in the original Avengers movie, ironically enough, considering that Joss Whedon was brought in to Avengerize this story. And he is talking to these folks that are elsewhere and trying to prove his worth. Now, as part of this plotline, Steppenwolf greatly improved, better renderings, more clear motivations. You also get some weirdness because Zack Snyder can't resist himself, and so he introduces a secondary concept to go along with the mother boxes of this thing called the anti-life equation, which is apparently carved into the surface of the Earth. He also adds the mythology here that says that Earth is the only planet that ever properly defied Darkseid, his troops, and Steppenwolf and everybody else. And then somehow he lost both the mother boxes and the anti-life equation to the mists of history. It's weird. It's certainly understandable. You're trying to create something like the Lord of the Rings, I think. You think of that prologue where it says, it faded into mythology as the ring sat at the bottom of this riverbed. The problem is that Darkseid and his crew found this planet, found what they were looking for, know they lost 3 mother boxes there. It's their only defeat in the history of their entire army. And it's hard to see how that goes from, I know which planet it is. It's Earth. That's where all the stuff I want is, to even 10,000 years later, 100,000 worlds, whatever they say, losing the address of that specific location. And so you do have to kind of skip those kinds of things. I think mostly when I'm watching a Snyder version of one of these movies, the DC Extended Universe or what have you, there are always a couple of beats where you have to kind of skip ahead. They aren't the tightest, most well-plotted movies, and I think that can throw a lot of people off. I don't blame them. If that's something that you just say, I'm off the ship. Martha, why did you say that name? I'm off the ship. I'm not interested in these kinds of things. That is totally fair, and I think the anti-life equation, which is unnecessary for this movie and is really setting up a sequel, is one of those areas where you get into these conversations and everything is cooler, more motivated, with better agency, and yet still you get to the end state here and you're like, well, okay, anti-life equation, that's great, but what does that all mean? You also then get into the end state here, and I think this is really where Zack Snyder's Justice League just absolutely crushes the Justice League of 2017. You've got these character motivations that we talked about, right? And in 2017, you will see that they were setting up a much more fractious Justice League. That Joss Whedon's approach, and there's none of these scenes are really copied over into the version that we watched in 2021, is that Batman and Wonder Woman don't agree, and Cyborg doesn't agree, and Aquaman doesn't agree, and they're all kind of infighting, trying to emulate, I would guess, those scenes in the original Avengers movie where they're fighting over the staff and everybody's arguing with everybody else. In 2021, everybody's basically motivated in the same way. You don't get those fights. You don't get Wonder Woman shoving Batman. You don't get those scenes in the bedroom. You don't get those kinds of things. They are all, once they realize that the mother box could potentially restore Superman, they're basically all on board. And from there, it makes a lot more sense than the 2017 version. Superman comes back. The scene that they have against Superman is basically the same. I do think it's worthwhile to note a couple of places where Joss Whedon, I think, did better. And I think Joss Whedon's idea to have Batman bring Lois Lane in and have that agency in the Superman fight in the 2017 version is probably a better beat than just the gauntlet catching the energy and Lois Lane being there. That goes along with some of the indulgences that Zack Snyder has in his movie, which is this notion of like the Martian Manhunter who appears and who is the general or commander whose name I can't quite recall. But he comes in and is essentially faking as being Martha Kent to convince Lois Lane to go back to work and ostensibly to be in that position, to be a part of the world, a part of the living, as he says, that can bring Superman back from the brink. It would seem, but it does lose Batman an important beat of agency, and I think it's a little bit better in the 2017 version. Outside of that, however, Superman is handled so much vastly better in this version than he was in 2017. He has a wonderful scene where he selects a new suit, and you get voiceovers from his two fathers, Jor-El and Jonathan Kent, talking to him some of the lines that you heard in Man of Steel and in Batman versus Superman, as he goes and he selects the new suit. The black and silver suit is fantastic. I love it. But that's one of those things I recognize from my limited touches to comic book fandom. So I thought that was fantastic. His arrival is great. Everything in the third act is vastly improved from 2017. Most importantly, it's not just people that don't have much to do fighting against a squadron of these winged things and Steppenwolf. Every single character in the Justice League, and this is, I think, the most important thing of putting one of these movies together, especially in the final act, has something important to do. Batman has something to do. Wonder Woman is just brutalizing everybody. And Wonder Woman is one of those interesting things in this movie where if you go and you look at 2017, she looks a little bit weak. And some of that is Joss Whedon. Some of that is the lack of the slow-mo, ironically enough. And in 2021, Wonder Woman is just killing people left and right. The Flash is the ultimate savior of the whole thing because he's able to restore and travel back in time, restore the world after the Unity actually takes place. Cyborg has to go and fight the Mother Boxes, as we talked about. Again, the closest thing to underserved here is Aquaman, who basically is just a dude bro who wanders around with a pitchfork or trident or whatever you want to call it, depending on which version of the movie you are watching, and does some good damage, but doesn't quite have the same arc as the rest of these characters. But by the time you get to them boarding the ship, the time you get to this fight, you don't have a Russian family wandering around. You don't have all of these stupid 15 minutes of interstitials of watching this Russian family straight out of the end of WandaVision just doing nothing and getting saved by the Flash or Superman at the end of the movie. You instead get all of these characters motivated properly that go through the film, get to the end, and each have something to do. And then you get to the very end of the movie, you get that voiceover from Silas Stone, and you cut off in a great place. Unfortunately, Zack Snyder doesn't have an editor on this, so that cutoff where you get the final drawing of the Superman S cut to black actually occurs at about 3 hours and 40 minutes into the movie, and then you get a lot of random stuff. You get more of that Martian Manhunter, you get Lex Luthor talking to, and I'm not versed enough in this stuff, I think it's Deathstroke. You can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong on that. You get the Joker from Jared Leto talking about nonsense, setting up a future movie. And in my opinion, a quick fix to all of this could be done if you just cut to credits after the end of the Silas Stone voiceover, Superman going off with his S, black, cut to a few credits, and then you separate out all the rest of this stuff into the post-credit stuff. I think Marvel actually does a very good job of this. Now, Marvel's not going anywhere, but if they were a little bit more on the precipice, like Zack Snyder's Justice League is, I think the movie ends with that final set of character montages. Then you get all this future-looking stuff. And if that were a little bit after the credits, I think it would be easier to separate. I think everything through that ending should probably be pre-epilogue, where it's actually in the quote-unquote epilogue as described by Zack Snyder. And then all of this kind of stuff, which is interesting enough as a kind of deleted scenes pickup, is not actually the movie that you just watched. It's not an epilogue to the film that you've been enjoying for 3 hours and 45 minutes. It is instead a prelude to another movie, which, because of the way all of this happened, is very, very, very unlikely to ever occur. So I think, like we talked about, this is a very good movie that I enjoyed a lot. I have a greater appetite for Zack Snyder doing what he's doing with his movies. I like the reach exceeding your grasp. I like trying for new stuff, not just getting complacent in kind of the house style and doing the next movie where a superhero fights the exact shadow version of itself, and there's some quips and there's some nice bright colors, and we move on to the next one. Which isn't to say I think that most of this is better than the best of Marvel. I think Infinity War is the best comic book movie ever made. I don't think these arrive at that level. I think there's too much that you have to skip. There's too much that you have to kind of cover over in your brain in terms of plotting and logic. You could easily get rid of 15 minutes of musical montages and nobody would be the wiser, and you would have a tighter, better movie. But this is Zack Snyder's Justice League. You get all of the improvements and all of the indulgences baked into one. And it is a vastly superior movie to Joss Whedon's. But is there an even better movie in there? I would argue that there is. As I said, this movie finishes at 3 hours and 40 minutes. And I think if you made a 3-hour version of this movie, and I don't think it would be that hard to do, you would have a very, very good version of the Justice League. So I think Zack Snyder needs an editor, but he needs an editor that isn't as rough as Warner Brothers was to him on the original theatrical cut of Batman vs. Superman, as Joss Whedon and Warner Brothers were when cutting apart his stuff and leaving his name as directed by, which is clearly a little bit suspicious after you watch both versions against each other. But he needs that editor that has a light hand rather than a heavy hand, and I think he's done some really great work, and I'm glad this exists. I'm glad Release the Snyder Cut happened. I'm glad that this movie is out there that we can enjoy because it's so much better than the 2017 version, and it's a much better tonal match to what Zack Snyder was trying to achieve in Batman vs. Superman, in Man of Steel. And yes, it's dour and depressing, and it might not be the characters as you remember them, and it's perfectly fine to criticize all these movies on that basis. But if you put that aside and you just say, okay, this is what Zack Snyder wants to present, this is who these characters are in this movie sequence, I think 2021's Justice League does them a great deal of service. Now, before we get to the questions and having this conversation with everybody, I do want to say there's a number of other complaints that I have seen that I agree with. One of them is it doesn't have to be 4 hours. You don't have to do this Cyborg intro. You don't have to do all this Flash stuff if you had properly set up the movies in advance. And I think that's correct, right? Marvel got the lead. They got the jump out of the starting gate, and they had Captain America and Iron Man and Thor, and I think even Iron Man 2 before Avengers starts. And that is the better way to do it. In an ideal world, the perfect world, I think, would be to have that Man of Steel movie, then a Caped Crusader movie, then whatever you want to call is kind of a secondary titling for Wonder Woman. And then in two of those, probably have cameo appearances by Cyborg and or Flash and Aquaman, and then go directly into Justice League, maybe with another movie like an Iron Man 2, and get from those singular entries, especially Batman. Batman really needed his own movie, Ben Affleck's Batman, before heading into the Justice League and Batman versus Superman. You head into Batman versus Superman, you head into Justice League, and it's all going to play better. But I will say this. I am never in favor of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we can't have those movies, and those movies aren't popping into existence 5 years ago, then this, covering Cyborg, covering Flash, doing a little bit better work with Aquaman before heading directly into the third act and dealing with some of the things on a character basis that are important to those characters and motivate them into getting into that third act is probably the best we could hope for. Having a 3 hour and 10-minute movie instead of 4, of course, actually leading into these character beats is a vast improvement over, we're not going to intro anybody, we're not going to give them their own movies, and we're going to try to bring this in at, I think 2017's heads to credits at like an hour and 53 minutes, which is just not enough time to introduce new characters into this Justice League. So that's basically my overview of this. I think it's great. I think it has those indulgences that can turn people off. I am very happy it exists. I think it's a good match for Batman versus Superman and Man of Steel. And I am very happy to have this kind of arc of storytelling because I think it's great to have a juxtaposition to what Marvel's doing. I don't think you need to copy Marvel and do it worse, which is what Justice League did in 2017. I think you can do your own thing. And yeah, I hope that the people that love these characters ultimately get a Superman that matches more with what they see as Superman and a Batman that does the same. But if this is the arc that Zack Snyder wanted to put on screen, I think this is the proper ending. Not this scene, not the Joker scene. A little bit earlier than that. Some of the Superman stuff, some of the third act stuff. I think this is the proper ending to what he's delivered, and I would certainly pay money to watch Zack Snyder with maybe a slightly heavier editing hand, but not as heavy as Warner Brothers put on him before, be able to make more movies in this fashion, in this universe. Much like the Joker movie that doesn't connect directly with the DC universe. If you want to have your own that makes more sense for Superman and everybody else that loves those characters, but also have a Zack Snyder Injustice universe, Mortal Kombat style, I would be all for it, and I'd be very interested to see what he had to do. Now I'm going to take a sip of water here. As you might know if you've been in Virtual Legality a little bit in the recent past, I've been pretty sick. And I've been fighting off a cough here for the last couple of minutes, so I'm going to take a sip of water. But yeah, let's talk about what you all think. If you've watched this movie, I'm now paying attention to the chat. And let me know how silly I am or what comments or criticisms you have so we can talk about that here in this live space. That's why I'm doing it live. All right. Let's see what we've got here. All right. Yeah, DC had zero patience. Yeah, absolutely. Right? Like, that's what happened. They saw Marvel Cinematic Universe coming together, Avengers making all this money, and DC said, well, we've got better characters than them. And truth be told, especially before the contracts happened and Fox was bought, a lot of what Marvel had sold was their best, most popular characters. They didn't have Spider-Man when this whole thing started. And DC said, we got Batman, we got Superman, we got Wonder Woman, and so let's just all toss them in there. And I also think Zack Snyder, for this particular project, matching Marvel movie for movie, is a bad fit. I think Zack Snyder gets a bum rap. I think he over indulges in things, but he also puts great visuals on screen, much more than a lot of the directors in Marvel, and much more than Joss Whedon, obviously, right? So at bare minimum, if you just like to see cool comic book splash pages and very cool fighting and comic book action, if you just watch the last act, just chapter 6 of Zack Snyder's Justice League, you are going to be blown away by some of the stuff there. He's a tremendous action director, and perhaps even more so than some of the bigger name directors in other movies, and certainly in Marvel. But DC picked him to do this kind of story when he wasn't working with the archetypal versions of these characters, and I think it turned off a lot of people at the start. The other thing that turned off people at the start, I think, is you go and watch Batman versus Superman, the theatrical edition. It doesn't make any sense at all. That's what I mean by a heavy-handed editorial hand. They wanted to bring it in a certain amount of time to keep rotating those theaters, and the story was absolutely crushed. You watch the director's cut of Batman versus Superman, you don't have to love it, but it makes a lot more sense than the theatrical edition. Much like here in 2021, you look at this Justice League and you see, oh, there's a movie there. There's something that was good that would have made people interested and invested in the universe, and instead you released that version in 2017, and that didn't work for anybody. You needed somebody to just kind of patch things up and deliver this movie maybe a little bit shorter in 2017. You didn't need to go back to the foundations, make everybody quip at each other about talking to fish and what brunch is and all this kind of ad-lib garbage. And instead, be earnest, be serious, don't go for that Marvel superficial irony, and deliver a set of movies that are different in kind and not just discount versions of what Marvel had to deliver. What else we've got here? I would have loved if William Dafoe was Joker instead of that fish dude. Well, I think Jared Leto's fantastic. I think he would make a good Joker. I'm not sure he's ever gotten the good opportunity to actually have a script where he gets to kind of play with that. Jared Leto is a captivating presence on screen, I have to say. And I think if he were given the chance, he'd do a good job. But I don't think this instance or, of course, Suicide Squad is really showing that off terribly well. I like 300, which was a perfect match for his sensibilities. Yeah, you get a little bit of 300 in the big, long fight sequence here, right? You get, when they're talking about their history, you get Zeus in very 300-styled look and a lot of almost, I don't know, cartoonish effects. Cartoonish might be wrong. It almost looks like a painting. A lot of this movie has this kind of gauzy look to it, which I think is really, really interesting. I think it could turn people off. Certainly as a person that loves video games, it reminds me of some of those kinds of cutscene effects, an attempt to make things look almost like they're painted. And I think that the actual fight here at the end of part 2, which is one of my favorite parts of the movie, even though I don't love Gal Gadot's reading of the history of all of this, that I think that he kind of tapped into what he was doing with 300 for a bunch of these fight scenes. I think it worked out really well. I also enjoy 300. It's a little bit more stylized. I don't know if you've watched it recently. It's a little bit more stylized than I remembered when I dived back into it. But it is a very interesting movie, and it's certainly Zack Snyder really at the top of his game in terms of sensibilities. But I also like that rendered owl movie, so, you know, what can I say? Plot holes were never my real issue with any of the theatrical cuts. Louis, you got to tell me what that bullet is even doing in the theatrical version of that movie. Like, all the stuff related to Lex's plot and all the stuff related to that bullet is gone forever and doesn't make any sense in the context of the theatrical version. But certainly it's faster, and sometimes if people aren't enjoying themselves, you just want to get them in and out as fast as possible. 300 is one of my all-time favorite movies, sure. Zack Snyder should be allowed to continue his story in an appropriate medium, like a pile of comics cut up and stuck together with a Pritt stick and footage of him playing with a box of action figures. This is sad. I just said I like this movie, Louis. You're coming up against me. No, look, it is certainly the case that Zack Snyder and his taste and what he's putting together is not going to be for everyone. This, to me, sounds a little bit of the kind of Death Stranding of the movie world, right? Death Stranding was my top game of 2019, and I would be remiss to recommend it to basically anyone. You got to try it out for yourself. I can't promise you'll like it. I can't promise you'll hate it. Very similar to Zack Snyder's Justice League. Now, I think it has a lot going for it. I've watched it, like I said, basically 1.5 times at this point in time, and I'll probably finish up that second viewing, after I get done with this video. But it's not for everybody. It's certainly not for people that like the Marvel approach more. It is almost the antithesis to that Marvel approach, but I like to have antitheses out in the world. I like to have those different opinions and different methods and different systems of making stories because I think it's great. And I think certainly this project, as somebody that loves talking about this stuff and thinking about how narrative works, is 100% fascinating. You go into the same moment of a plot in 2017 and 2021, and you see the same characters in the same room have a completely different discussion. It's like playing Mass Effect or something like that, where you've made different choices 2 hours ago or 6 hours ago, and everybody has different feelings towards one another, and it still kind of arrives in the same place, But you look at both of those options and you say, well, is the Paragon path or the Renegade path more clunky in getting you to these various plot points? In almost every instance, I'd say the Renegade path is. And very similarly, in 2017, the connective tissue between getting from big moment 1 to big moment 2 and on to the end of the game, end of the movie, doesn't make as much sense as what Zack Snyder has put on screen as of Thursday of this week. All right. And that appears to be it. I don't think I have any more questions. So if anybody has any more questions, jump in before I call the stream here. Otherwise, I think we're going to be done. We're going to be done talking about the Justice League right now. Of course, people can comment on this video, can comment elsewhere, and I'll respond to them as much as possible. But otherwise, I think we're just about set talking about the Justice League. It's a movie that I very much enjoyed. I can't promise you will enjoy it. I'm glad it exists. And I think if you are at all interested in what it is, whether it's just as a comparison to 2017 or actually you like Zack Snyder and you think maybe this will be a better fit for the movie that's an immediate successor to Batman versus Superman, it is well worth trying out on your own. And I'll let Louis get the last comment in here. Imagine a timeline where Nolan did a Superman movie connected to his Dark Knight trilogy. I would have vastly preferred that as a Justice League starting point. Yeah. You know, I mean, the Dark Knight trilogy is interesting because it's its own beast, right? By the time you get to the end of Dark Knight Rises, first of all, I think Christopher Nolan isn't as interested in the comic book side of things as he was when he started out. So Dark Knight Rises is not my favorite, but it's a very clear ending. And it seems unlikely that Batman is going to come back and do anything, especially since Dark Knight Rises suggests that he retired for 8 years and didn't do anything at all. But I agree that Christopher Nolan would have been an interesting choice to do Superman. I like Man of Steel, while still fully recognizing everybody's complaints that that's not the Superman that they grew up knowing. I tend to agree with that. But for the Superman that was delivered to us, I think it makes sense on a plot basis. And I think he kind of enters into Batman versus Superman still understanding his version of Superman as a character. And I do try when I watch these movies, when I watch any movie, I try to look at them and say, all right, let's try to put my assumptions away and you deliver to me what you want to deliver, and then we'll figure it out from there. But certainly when you're making a comic book movie, when you're making something based on a big IP, when you're making a Last Jedi, you do have certain obligations to the people that are fans of the characters and of the story that's already been presented. And I totally understand when people come and say that he failed to do that. I like these movies. I don't like them as much as the best of Marvel. But like I said, I'm glad it exists. All right. Well, with that, thank you for joining me this morning. I just wanted to talk about this very impromptu, very short warning on the live aspect of this. So I apologize for anybody that wants a better heads up and wants to join me for these conversations a little bit more. Otherwise, thank you so much for popping in. We'll be doing more virtual legality next week. And I think the weekends are probably the best place where we talk about this pop culture stuff, if and when something pops up that we want to talk about. So otherwise, thank you so much. Have a great Saturday. Have a great rest of your weekend. And I will catch you on the next episode of the Hoeg Law YouTube channel. Thanks again.